Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well and staying safe. For this video, we'll be going through a unboxing and review of the Marvel's Apocalypse figure from the Uncanny X-Men / X-Men, basically anything X-Men related, really. And this particular version of this Apocalypse figure has been released this year being 2022. I believe this one will be from Hasbro, but it may have been from Kenner. I'm actually not too sure. I feel this is potentially also a re-release of this figure from a decade ago, but collectors these days. Anyway, so the last time I did a figure would have been the figure from the X-Men universe, was the retro Sentinel, and here we basically now have, I dare say, retro Apocalypse. So Apocalypse was quite surprisingly not a smallish figure. The card backing is on par with the actual size of the backing that the Sentinel was attached with, so he's definitely not on the small end, which I guess is good. Apocalypse wasn't exactly known as a small character in the good old days, or the current days, with the exception of one movie, but we won't go there. But that I think is actually quite cool. So he's in some level of scale. In terms of what we have on the front of the packaging, so we have Apocalypse in a nice little plastic window. He will have a alternative head sculpt, 2 alternative hands, his traditional cabling from his arms to his back, if I remember correctly. And what else does he have? He has a included weapon blaster, which is basically his hand shifting into one. And he will also have some small blaster effects. So he has 2 small ones here, and there's a larger one here just behind his left hand. Otherwise, a very imposing looking version of Apocalypse. Definitely a more truer reflection of Apocalypse, probably pre-2000s, which is good. I quite enjoyed some of those early looks of Apocalypse, and to be honest, I wouldn't mind an Age of Apocalypse, but I feel I've missed that boat. But there was also some foreshadowing there, but I'll leave that as that. Other than the figure, we do have the line art of Apocalypse, as well as, not that it'll show it very nicely, so the top of the box, well, the packaging has the Uncanny X-Men logo there, as per the comic line from many a time ago, and a nice little up logo in the corner of Marvel Comics with Rogue, Wolverine, Gambit, and Storm. So that's the front. In terms of the back, so we just have a nice shot of the Apocalypse figure. So it does look like he'll have some articulation, probably more so than what we encountered with the Sentinel, which is really cool. I mean, based on that, he'll probably have an elbow, he'll have his hands, but we will see further in a moment. The back, I will admit, is fairly plain, but that's okay. The other item of interest is just a little blurb included about Apocalypse in different languages, but in terms of the English, basically it goes, "Look upon the future and tremble," which I feel he said in the animated series. "He is Apocalypse, the world's most powerful mutant, and from the ashes of our world he will build a better one." I do believe he actually does say that line almost word for word in the actual original animated series from the 90s. Boy, I really miss watching some of that. One of these days I'll have to do a bit of a rewatch of some of that, probably before the new animated continuation comes out, possibly in 2023. And yes, that's pretty much the interesting parts of the back of the packaging and all the usual stuff that you usually see on most items. So that is a look of the actual packaging that Apocalypse came in. So I will do what I can to open up the box and get Apocalypse out so we can have a better look. And with Apocalypse out of his plastic wrapping, he's actually a fairly hefty figure. So if I quickly pick him up, he has some heft to him. If I thought, I mean, he's not super heavy, but yes, he's solid. He's very solid, to say the least. Real quick shot of the head sculpt detailing for Apocalypse. So that is Apocalypse, but before we do that, have a quick look at what he came with first. So we have his two cables. So before I attach them, they are somewhat rubberized. So no doubt adding them will be fairly easy and straightforward, to the point of I kind of wish I knew which end went where. Downside of these things, they don't include instructions. Okay, so in theory, this should actually go into his back. And they do seem to plug in quite nicely. And then the straight end will go into the back of his forearm. And then rinse and repeat on the other side. So there you go. Those are his cables attached, and because they are somewhat rubberized, they do actually have some flexibility to them, so no doubt as his arms move and things like that, they will repose accordingly. So those are that done. In fact, now that I've done that, I might actually need to stand Apocalypse, so feel free to look at Apocalypse top down. Actually no, he will still do that. Goes to show, yes, that rubberization is coming in handy. So there you go for Apocalypse. Two included closed fists, one being a left hand, one being left hand, one being right. There is some nice detailing on them as well. If I can just, there we go. So not too bad. So we have two of those. We have the alternative head sculpt. So not quite an, I mean, it's probably Apocalypse's resting face, which, well, suffice to say, he was never a happy individual. But the detailing is quite nice. And should just attach quite nicely as a normal ball and socket. So that was his head. We have a blaster, which I do feel is similar to the one he does use a few times in the animated series. There will be some connection points to use for those blast effects, which we'll look at shortly, but that is very cool. Hopefully it's not too difficult to slide into his relevant hand. There is a little, I was going to say there's a moving part in there, but there isn't. Well, at least it doesn't feel like it moves. So it should just slot into a particular hole. I mean, looking at the back of his hands, it's just pretty much slotting them in. So that's his blaster. I'm assuming this is the right way up. It's nice that they have added on some extra colors in the way of the purple and some of that orangey trim on the black. And lastly, we have some blast effects. These are also in a bit of a rubberized material as well, so that's probably the larger effect. And then we have two very smaller ones as well. And I guess just to see them in action, just watch me just throw everything around the place. And how about we do that? So there you go. So the blaster equipped with the 3 effects, which will obviously attach to Apocalypse later down the track. So, Apocalypse. What do we have? So, as I was mentioning, he's a bit of a hefty boy, which is fine. In terms of height, so, or should I actually use this one? Nope, I will use this one. He's probably about 20 to 21 centimeters tall. He will stand quite well on his own 2 feet unaided, which is very cool. So that's the front of Apocalypse. The side. The back. The other side. And from a front angle. So very cool. In terms of his colors, I'd say they're very accurate to some of his earlier form colors. With the, I'm not sure if the purple was his primary or the blue was his primary. Either, he has his very traditional solid blue and solid purple. The detailing is quite nice throughout his body, so there's some nice detailing on his lower limbs. His hands we know are quite detailed. The A on his belt, which I honestly suspect is for Apocalypse, would make the most sense. And his head section is also quite detailed. We've already had a look at that head sculpt. So before we even bother looking at some of the accessory attachments, in terms of articulation, so his head will definitely have some up and down, especially within his neck housing. So definitely up and down, have some lefting and righting. I don't want to try doing it into 360s because I've never understood why a head should do that. But overall, he does have a good amount of movement within his head. And obviously we'll be detaching that head later on to see what the alternative head sculpt looks like. So that's very cool. So his head's got some good options for articulation, posing, things like that. That's obviously quite solid. Now it looks like he does have a bit of a ab crunch. So you can go a bit to the front, although he doesn't seem to stay that way. Or hold up. Maybe he does. Because I can hear that click, so I'm assuming that's a clicking interlock. Does he go backwards? He'll go backwards a little bit. But it seems that click will effectively restore him back into his standard. He does have a little bit of waist articulation, but by swiveling him to either the left or the right, it does make his little waist belt move ever so slightly. It's not too bad. In a way, it's actually good because it moves with the form, but after a while it does become rather odd looking. In fact, it looks like he can actually do the full 360, so there you go. Not too bad. Creepy, but he can do it. As for the arms, so what do we have? So in terms of the shoulders? Okay. So the blue bit doesn't move. So his actual shoulder is here. So that will move to the front, like so. So that's to the front, to the standard resting stationary pose, and it will go all the way to the back. Now, you can probably see it as I move his arm back, it is starting to dislodge some of the piping. So depending how extreme you want to be with his arms, the more drastic the movement, the more the piping will be dislodged, which, you know, isn't too bad. You can pull it back in if need be. His arms will not do a full 360 just because of that shoulder armor, so that seems to be the limit of his front. In terms of the back, that's pretty much the limit of his back. Once again, that piping starting to pop out. It does make me wonder if this is detachable-ish. Maybe not. It does move a little bit, but I wouldn't recommend doing very extreme poses with his arms. So that was at the actual shoulder. He does have a... can he actually move? Ah, yes, he can also move his arm out as well. With his arm moved out, what does he have here? Oh, he's got some swivel within the shoulder joint as well. In fact, that's probably the best way to get that 360 there, within the shoulder. But he also has some... okay, well, that's unplugged itself, but that's okay for the purpose of articulation. So you'll also have a full 360 within the upper arm as well. He will have a elbow bend. In fact, if I bring him back down this way. In fact, where is your arm, Apocalypse? Okay. So there will be this little indicator of probably where his arm movement should be. So that will reset his arm back into that position. So just bear in mind that's probably there. In terms of his elbow, that'll be how far forward he can go. That'll be the elbow back in its downward position, and it won't go any more backwards than that. So it does make a bit of a clicking feel. Not a huge click, but feels like there's two positions there. So that's probably about, it's definitely not 90 degrees, maybe 45. So that's the elbow. And as for the wrist, so the hands can do a full 360, and as I'm sure we'll find out later, that's probably because of the hands just being, using this hand as an example, just slotted in. So that was his arms. So we'll attach that back in. So his arms have some decent amount of articulation in them. Definitely a step up from the Sentinel. Just going to move his arms out ever so slightly like this. Now, as for his legs, so can Apocalypse do the full splits? Not quite the full splits, but he does have the ability to stick his legs out that far. He can move his leg that far forward, but he will not be able to move it back, at least not at the waist. His legs can do a full 360 at the upper leg. Don't know why you would need to do that, but there you go, you can. Which I guess will be good. So at least from a posing perspective, at least you can move his legs somewhat. So waist done, upper legs. In terms of the knee, so if I bring his leg out like that, his knee seems to have, so it's a 2-point knee by the looks of things. So his first point will get him down like that. So that's as far as this upper point, I believe, will take him. It does have a bit of a clicking feel, and that'll put him back to the top position. As for this other part down here, so he can also do some movement at this second knee point as well. To the point, I guess, you can actually do that with his leg. You can actually have it bending over at the top and then bending at the bottom part of the knee as well. That's putting it back into position. That's putting it back to the front. So that is his knee area. Very nice. And then in terms of his feet, so his feet can do a full 360 at the ankle, and looks like the ankle can also do some lefting and righting, forward, well, backwards and forwards as well. Which does make me wonder, was this Apocalypse a build-a-figure back in the day? I don't want to find out, because he wasn't exactly cheap to get, hence why I only have one of him. But yes, he's got a good amount of articulation within the ankle as well, so he'll be able to do some more wider stances because his ankles will move. He can lean a bit forward. He can also lean backwards on that joint as well. So that was a bit of breakdown of the articulation of the Apocalypse figure, which is definitely not too bad. Now, I will, for the sake of comparisons, bring into view the Sentinel. So if I can try and get their feet roughly together. So they are roughly around the same size. Well, height. In terms of articulation, Apocalypse has infinitely more articulation than our dear friend the Sentinel. But that's okay. We don't mind. The Sentinel can still pull off some of his iconic posing. We are okay with that. But there you go. That's a bit of a height comparison between the two. So now that we've looked at Apocalypse per his inclusions that were actually attached within the packaging, let's switch things out. So we will try switching out his hands. So with his hands out, and it does look like... So there's the actual movement in the hand, so it is within this actual piece here. It actually does remind me of some of the pieces from various Gunpla as well. I definitely wouldn't recommend moving it by putting the force directly on that piece, because I feel over time that'll be probably prone to snapping, but if you're going to move it, do it properly. But that's also what the hand looks like as well. So we're switching out both his hands, and we will switch out his head. So that's a closer look of Apocalypse's head. So that is Apocalypse deheaded and dehanded. In terms of attaching his alternative sculpts in. So there is his head in place. One hand, two hand. So compared to the Sentinel, not that the Sentinel really had much other than its accessories, switching out the components for Apocalypse actually was quite straightforward and easy. So with the new hands in, they will obviously go around 360 within the sockets, which is cool. The head is still going to do the exact same as the previous head sculpt does. But he does have that more of the resting neutral face than his angry face. But I do like how he has more of the closed fist look. I wonder if he can actually fold his arms over. Not really. He doesn't have that much articulation. I was going to say if he could fold his arms over to enhance his resting face, but apparently not. So that's Apocalypse with different head sculpt, different hands. The last thing to do will be to change out one hand for his blaster. Oh. 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 Well, there you go. The forearm sleeve is actually detachable. So that is the forearm for Apocalypse. Interesting. Just to show off some more of that elbow bend that's there. So it's basically a case of attaching that and then attaching the cable into the new cable port, which is at the bottom side of the weapon. And then there you go. Apocalypse with his blaster. Very, very imposing looking. So I guess if we can just do that, just to show off what the blaster looks like once it's been switched over. And we do know that there'll be some articulation there within that section, so that will move up and down a little bit. Otherwise, the rest of the articulation will be what we've seen in the arm before. So that's actually quite cool. Probably take some time to try and pose him into something a bit more dynamic. But yeah, let's see if I can, not that you can really tell because he's going to be standing up and the camera will be looking down on him, but if I try and do that, it's a bit of a pose, granted not showing up very well just because of angling. Okay, so we'll just rest Apocalypse there. So now that we've had a solid look at Apocalypse, his articulation, his included accessories, what are my final thoughts for Apocalypse? I quite like this figure. I've always had a interesting feel for a lot of the X-Men villains compared to a lot of the other villains in the other Marvel comic line series. Something about the X-villains, they're unique. I mean, you have the Sentinels, you have Apocalypse, Mr. Sinister, Magneto. Granted, he flip and flops. Hellfire Club, they flip and well, I wouldn't say they flip and flop. And a whole heap of other X-villains that some are no longer villains, some of them still are, some of them have changed allegiances, etc. Yeah, the storylines for X-Men comics are all over the shop. So I guess from a final thoughts perspective, I quite like the included accessories. It's nice that he has the 2 head sculpts, alternative hands, and that he is given this blaster as well with the effects, which is very cool. The articulation was actually surprisingly quite good for a figure of his size, and I dare say a figure of his age. I don't believe the figure is brand new in the sense of being produced, well, as a brand new mold of this figure. So for what it can do is really good. The figure itself is quite sturdy. I'll get a better feel for the articulation when I try and take some pictures of him, but from this unboxing video itself, he seems like he's got a good amount of articulation and movement to pull off some dynamic poses, which is good. The colors are good. I quite like them, and the detail that he has as well is quite good as well. And plus, it's nice that these cables are of that rubbery material, so actually do move with it. I can imagine if they were like a very solid and non-rubber type material, they'd probably get a bit frustrating because they'd probably just pop out because they don't try to move with his arms. I would say if you're a fan of Apocalypse, a fan of anything X-Men, a fan of the supervillains within the X-Men series, he will be a worthy addition to your collection. I'm definitely glad I have him, and I did make the comment earlier, I would definitely not mind having a Age of Apocalypse version of Apocalypse. Much like I wouldn't mind having an Onslaught, but I think in both cases the boat has sailed. I think Onslaught was a Build-A-Figure in many series prior. I'm not sure if they made an Age of Apocalypse figure, but yeah, it would have been cool to have both, but this particular Apocalypse I do like, and he does have some callbacks back to the 90s animated series as well, so I do like that as well. And I think that would have been probably my main exposure to Apocalypse outside of the comics as well that I was reading back in the 90s. So yes, definitely a recommended addition to the collection, and I think there's a bit more playability with this particular Apocalypse figure compared to the retro Sentinel. But once again, it also depends. The Sentinels were also something that I quite enjoyed as well, so I think I'll be very hard pressed to say no to some of these figures. But as we go through a few more figures, there may yet be some that I nay to as a recommendation, but we will see. Thank you very much for watching this dual unboxing and review video of Apocalypse. Feel free to leave a like, a comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the content. All of this does help support the channel, and I do greatly appreciate it. Extra content can also be found on my Instagram account, link below. Stay safe and take care, and I will catch you all in a future video, whether it's a review of a Marvel figure or something else on my channel. See ya.